Hello everybody, it's Professor Parish again, and so we are now at drama, believe it or not. So this is one presentation for the entire drama section. You will probably notice that the drama section is a little bit shorter than some of our other presentations, and the reason for that is twofold. One, because I feel like we have other drama classes that you can take if you're interested in drama. You can take Intro to Drama with Mr. Kimball, or you can take Intro to Theater. Either one of those classes focuses a lot more on plays and the theater aspect of literature. And so I feel like this is just an introduction to it. It's just an appreciation sort of unit. And if you are interested in drama, I do encourage you to go and take one of those other classes. Most of your degrees will require you to have a humanities class, and Intro to Theater or Intro to Drama would be one of those classes. So if you're interested in this unit and you feel like maybe you're a little shortchanged, then I would encourage you to take one of those other classes too, because I think it would be rewarding. The second reason is because I want to give you guys more time to focus on your final paper, which is longer than the papers that we've been doing for fiction, poetry, and in this case drama. And I will actually post a separate video here in the next week or so where I go over that last paper and how to do that paper, because it's a little bit different than your traditional research paper. And so I kind of want to explain that in a video. But today we are going to finish our drama unit with this presentation, and I'll post the presentation by itself on our syllabus handouts and video page, and then you have this video to go alongside the presentation to help prep you for the exam. So, after we finished poetry, we skipped over chapters 23, 24, and 25, which were all about different poets and example poetry. And if you're a poetry buff, then I would, like with the fiction chapters, encourage you to look at those examples, and maybe possibly there were some that you considered for paper 2. I don't know, but you definitely feel free to check those papers out. But drama! I actually really like studying drama. I love looking at play scripts, things like that. I actually own several play scripts that are in novel form, and I really like it. I think it's a very different genre that has certain restrictions, but at the same time, not so many limitations, if that makes sense. And you might get that by the time we finish this presentation. But we are looking at 4 chapters for the drama unit, chapters 26 through 30 in our Discovering Literature book, which I have pulled up right here. And we actually start chapter 26, The Heart of Drama, on page 1131. So we've really gone through this book. Lots of example text. So, the big thing about drama that I think a lot of people neglect to remember is that it is a form of text. When you watch a movie or you view a play, people aren't just making that up on the spot. It's not like an improv group. It starts out as a screenplay, as a form of text, and it's translated into a physical performance. And so there's a lot of differences not only in how we write text, because a screenplay has to be very specific on who's talking, what the actions are. There's not supposed to be room for the audience to guess what's happening. The actors' performances kind of do that for the audience. But also, film and theater are such a different experience than just reading a book. In one of the videos you guys will watch for your discussion forum, John Malkovich, the actor, describes theater as being kind of like riding a wave. And if you've ever been in a play before, you kind of understand that once the play starts, there's no stopping until the end. I was actually in a play out at SIC when I was in college, and one performance we had, it was a musical, and this one character was supposed to say one specific line, and when that line was said, it started the musical number. Well, on the night of the play, the person playing that character forgot their line, and so we're all standing out there waiting for them to say something, and we know the line, but we can't say it. It would only make sense if they say the line, so we're sitting there like on the edge of the stage just waiting for them to say it, and it's not happening. And finally, one of the audience, not audience members, one of the people on stage, they were smart enough to say, "Don't you mean?" And they said the line for them, and then we jumped to the musical number. But it was that tension and the fact that it's live and there's an audience watching you and you can't really have room for error. You just have to go with it. That makes it a very unique experience. Whereas film is sort of taken shot by shot. So if you mess up, then you just do a different take. If you mess up, you keep doing it over and over again until you get the performance that you want. And text is already written out. It's already technically a past form that you're reading as the audience member. You can't contact the author and say, hey, can you go back and rewrite this? It's already set in stone. So there's three very different experiences in those genres of text. You've got theater, which is all live and in the moment and raw and organic, and you have film that is still organic but is more controlled, and then you have text, which is probably the most controlled format, in that it is already in stone what the author's intent was, and the reader can just read and either accept the text or not accept the text. There's no feedback that an actor gets in a book, if that makes sense. So it kind of makes drama very exciting in a way, because you're really dependent on that actor making it good or bad. And that's kind of scary for an author to think that their work is in the hands of someone else to be effective. So that's kind of the main difference between these. And through our discussion forums and our reading response, we're going to talk more about these differences. And kind of, I'm interested to see what you all prefer, what your opinions are, and so on and so forth. But getting into the terms of drama, these are kind of some of the main terms over these next few slides. The first being soliloquy, which I love that word, soliloquy. It is entire scenes of internal dialogue. And I always think that soliloquy and monologues are in the same family. A monologue, we've heard this term come up before. A monologue is just a point of internal dialogue in a scene, meaning that a character will say something out loud. Now, because it's a play and it's performed, it's not like when you read a book you can read what the characters are thinking. In a play, the character has to say what they're thinking, because we're not Professor X, we can't read their minds. So a monologue is a moment in a scene where a character reveals what they're truly thinking. So, for example, in Beauty and the Beast, when we have the opening song Belle, and Gaston has this little brief interlude where he kind of says, right from the moment when I met her, saw her, that whole point, that is a monologue. Because at that point, he's revealing what he's really thinking. You know, you may say that he's talking to LeFou, but in that scene, we don't really even see LeFou. It's just Gaston, like, looking in a mirror at himself. So he's just internally saying that, you know, Belle should get with me because I'm hot. And that's his monologue. Whereas a soliloquy is an entire scene of internal dialogue. It's not just a moment. It's a whole scene of a play. And I usually think of Shakespeare when I think of soliloquy. You got your two S's, soliloquy and Shakespeare. Because in Hamlet, there are entire scenes in the play of Hamlet where it's just Hamlet talking to himself, rationalizing what his plans are. So in that case, it takes up an entire scene, there's no other characters, and it's all Hamlet talking to himself and rationalizing his actions. So that is a soliloquy, an entire scene, versus a monologue, which is just a moment in a scene. So if it helps, I always think soliloquy is the longer, weirder word, so it's the longer scene of internal dialogue, whereas monologue is a moment. So hopefully that helps you remember. And then the two terms that kind of also go hand in hand are aside and confidant. Now, in a play, there is this suspension of reality, because whenever you watch a play, you realize that all the action is happening on this very condensed small stage. So we, the audience, have to kind of use our imagination and realize, okay, well, even though these characters are literally a foot apart, they could be talking, this character could be talking about the other character, and the other character doesn't hear this character talking about them. And we're expected to believe that because it's a set on a play and there's only so much space they can move around. So an aside is when two characters kind of go off to the side of the stage and talk in private on stage. Even if there's characters right beside them doing other things, we're, as the audience, expected to understand that these characters are kind of off doing their own thing, and it's private. Whereas the confidant is the secret keeper in the play. They are the person that is confided in to keep secret information. And usually in the play, the confidant is the one that messes up. They're the one that reveals something they're not supposed to. So for example, if in a play a woman tells her best friend that she's pregnant but she doesn't want anybody else to know, the best friend is the confidant. They're supposed to keep that a secret. Now whether they do or not depends on the play. But that's what those terms mean. So other terms in this opening chapter about drama, foil is one of my favorite terms, and please on your exam do not use the math definition of foil. I almost gave credit to a student once because I asked them, give me an example of foil, and they used the math definition, and I broke out in hives, I had sweaty palms, I got a fever. Kidding. But I did not give them credit for that, although it was extremely clever. So a foil is when there are two large personalities in a play and they play off of each other. And the most common example I can think of is that of a buddy comedy. So usually in a buddy comedy or a buddy cop movie, you have a stone cold serious, plays by the rule cop who has a strong personality. And then you have the wacky, zany newcomer who doesn't play by the rules and does his own thing. And they're two giant personalities, but they kind of play off of each other and kind of highlight how each one is good in their own ways. So think like Men in Black. You've got Tommy Lee Jones and Will Smith, two very big eccentric personalities, but in very different ways. That is a foil, and you will see these a lot of times in plays. A lot of plays rely on complex characters, so very much like our round characters. In fiction, they're multidimensional, three-dimensional, they have personalities, they have motivations, they have goals, because typically a play is about 3 hours long. So you're spending a lot of time with these characters, and you get to know them throughout the play, and that's kind of the point. And then recognition is self-realization that a character will gain by the end of the play. And then there are idioms. Idioms is a common phrase of a culture or language. And idioms are sort of hard to describe unless you've encountered someone who is not a native of this country. So for example, my friends in college used to teach a group of students from South Korea that came over to our college that I transferred to learn English. And one of the sections they taught them were American idioms. So for example, the Korean students, they did not understand the phrase, just kidding. They were like, what do you mean just kidding? What does kidding mean? And it was an idiom that, we say that all the time. We're like, oh, I'm just kidding you. And to us, we don't even think about it. We're like, oh yeah, that just means I'm joking. But to them, they weren't used to that phrase. And so they couldn't wrap their minds around the idea that just kidding meant to joke. And they were like, oh, do you mean like tradition of the joke? That was their phrase that meant just kidding. And then my friends were like, yes, that's it. But that's just an idiom, a phrase that means something to our culture, but may be hard for another culture to understand. And you see those pop up in plays, especially Shakespeare. On page 1138, I wanted to bring out this play as an example. And it's Don DeLillo, who's a very famous author and playwright. And he wrote this back in 2001, which is one of his later works, because if you'll notice, he was born in 1936. So he was fairly old when he wrote this. And it's just a very short, what we call a one-act play. It's just one scene, one act. It's very short. It can be acted out, 10 minutes or less. And it is called The Mystery at the Middle of Ordinary Life. And I want you guys to look at this play. I'm not going to read all of it because it is intentionally drawn out and long, but I want you guys to look at this play on page 1138 and see how his style, the symbolism, the elements of fiction that we see used in this drama make it very similar to Hills Like White Elephants by Hemingway, which we've already read, and also a little bit different too, because we learn a little bit more about these characters than in Hemingway's story. But when you get to the bottom, it starts out very long and drawn out in the conversation, and it slowly gets to a very short and choppy sentence. So I would ask you to read this and kind of think to yourself, what in the world is the point DeLillo is trying to make about couples and about relationships, and how does it compare to Hemingway's story? Because I think that when you compare them side by side, it's interesting. how they're similar and dissimilar. So that is your mini assignment with this presentation, is to read this play and kind of think about it for a little bit. All right? And speaking of which, on the very next page, we talk about plot and resolution, which we've gone over that with fiction already. But we also talk about internal versus external conflict. Internal, of course, is in the mind of the characters. External is in the physical world. And with plays, this becomes a very interesting dynamic, because everything internal in a play has to become external. Because, like I said, we can't read the minds of the characters, so they have to act out what they're thinking. So it can kind of make the line between reality and imagination sort of become blurred. And there's a specific play that we'll talk about when we get to American drama that does that to an interesting degree. Alright, more terms. Lots of terms in this chapter. Deus ex machina is one of my favorite terms. It is Latin for God machine. And a lot of times in Greek plays, which we'll talk about in a minute, it was a plot device that could get characters out of danger at the last minute. It was normally something that never came up again. It just happened at the end of the play, had no relation to the rest of the plot. It just happened and then it was over. And nobody questioned it. So we still see this in modern times. This is not something that has faded out of existence. I would say probably the two most common examples are that we've seen in modern movies are with Toy Story 3 and Jurassic Park. Spoilers, if you've seen Toy Story 3, you know that at the end Woody and his friends are about to be incinerated, and then at the last minute this claw comes down and it's the little toy aliens and they save them. Where were those toy aliens in the rest of the movie? We don't know. They just show up and save everybody, and then that's the last we ever see of them. That's a Deus ex machina. At the end of Jurassic Park, when the characters are about to be eaten by the raptors, what happens? A giant T-Rex just shows up and kills the raptors and they escape. How'd that T-Rex get in that building? Who knows? Who cares? Doesn't matter. It was a Deus ex machina. Save the characters and then we never talk about it again. Until Jurassic World. But that's kind of the point, is that they're last minute plot devices that writers would use. It was almost like a cameo at the end of the play that the audience could go, oh my gosh, look, Zeus is saving them. And it was just supposed to like get the audience excited. And we see that happen a lot in modern times. We've not let that trend go. So we also have subplots in a lot of our plays, and they're extra smaller threads that are kind of woven in to make the story seem richer and more developed. And we see this a lot in modern plays and modern shows as well. I mean, Game of Thrones, for example, there's a big central plot, but there's lots of smaller subplots that are kind of woven in to make the story seem grander and more developed. An ode we've talked about before is a tribute. In plays, it's typically sung by a chorus, which is a group of people, kind of like a choir. In the play Sweeney Todd, for example, the chorus gives a lot of exposition. They talk a lot about the characters and give us information that we need. So that's kind of their role in the play. And then rhymed couplets we see a lot in Shakespearean plays, and these are two lines in a play that end in rhyme. So the Lorax, Dr. Seuss, and all that probably would use rhyme couplets, but some plays still use them. You don't see them a lot in modern plays, usually just something like Shakespeare. Alright, so those are the play terms, and now we're going to get into Greek tragedy, chapter 27. And the reason why I think we touch on Greek tragedy is it is so integral to every modern play we see. Even if it's not paying homage to Greek tragedy, there are elements in Greek tragedies that have been used throughout multiple genres of plays, from modern times to, back when we were doing Shakespeare. And we'll talk more about Shakespeare in a little bit. But the messenger, for example, the person who delivers news to characters in plays, is a big role that still happens in plays. The phrase, "don't kill the messenger," comes from plays, because typically the messenger would relay very tragic news to the characters. Genre, that comes from Greek tragedy, and it's just a type of writing. We see genres now in nearly every kind of text, in music, in plays, in novels, and all kind of stemmed from Greek plays as well, just the type of writing and how it was different from another type. Now, these next couple of terms are all connected. Complication. We talked in fiction about plot, how the plot builds to a climax, and how it ends with a resolution. These terms are kind of woven in that structure in terms of plays. So a complication is the starting conflict. If we've got our roller coaster, the complication is that little point where we start to go uphill. It's that little starting point. It starts our conflict. It starts to build our actions towards the climax. The denouement is that build, and it's called in plays an unraveling. So the plot sort of keeps unraveling towards the climax. The peripety is what we call the twist in the story. Usually right around the climax we learn something important that twists the story, that makes a difference in the story. So like in Oedipus, for example, and Oedipus is a messed up play, but in the Greek tragedy of Oedipus, the twist we learn is when Oedipus finds out that about the prophecy about him, and that basically his entire existence has ruined so many people's lives. The twist is that rather than accepting or fighting the prophecy, he stabs his eyes out because he's so terrified and horrified of what he's done. And that's the twist. The twist is that he is his own undoing in that moment. And then finally there's a catharsis, which is a purging or cleansing of feelings, usually at the resolution. So probably the biggest example I can think of this is that if you watch Game of Thrones, the red wedding scene, the infamous red wedding scene, at the end when Catelyn Stark, she's lost pretty much everything around her, and she just has this like wash of emotion, like everything leaves her, and she's just left completely cleansed of emotion and just blank. That is catharsis. And typically at the end of the play, we find our main characters, if it's a tragedy, in a state of catharsis, where they've just either lost everything or there's no hope, and they just sort of have this like emotionless state. So that's those terms. Lovely, right? Alright, typically with Greek tragedy, we also have a tragic flaw. Our protagonist is usually someone that's very heroic, or is a character in mythology like Hercules or Achilles, and they typically have a tragic flaw, or whatever their ultimate weakness is. With Achilles, it was that if you hit his heel, he would die. But a lot of times the tragic flaw is not something physical, it'd be something like a mental state. So for example, hubris was a big tragic flaw for lots of characters. And hubris basically just means pride. So the phrase, pride goeth before the fall, that comes from plays. Because typically if a character was too proud, it would be their undoing. They'd be too proud to help themselves or help others, and it would lead to their downfall. And then pathos, actually, if you took 121 here, you probably encountered the word pathos. In modern times, we think of pathos as being an emotional persuasion. But in Greek terms, it was literally suffering. So, if persuasion and politics are suffering, of course. But that's just what the pathos term means in that context. And then our chapter touches upon, again, antagonists versus protagonists, which I hope from our fiction exam you got that question right, and that is the central character versus the opposing character. Not good or bad, but central versus opposing. Protagonist is the main character, antagonist is the person trying to stop them, whether they are good or bad. So, that's all the terms for Greek tragedy. They give us Antigone as an example, and one of your assignments with this unit is going to be to watch a video summarizing Antigone. So if you've never read Antigone, it is a good play in terms of Greek tragedy. I like it probably rather more than some of the others out there, but you'll watch a video if you've not read it that kind of summarizes the play for you, so you don't have to read 100 pages worth of play. But moving on, Shakespeare. We can't escape Shakespeare because he's so relevant. His work, for better or worse, shaped entire genres of literature. It shaped what we think about literature. It shapes how we analyze literature. His work is just so integral. And a lot of people, may think he's overrated, but he's unavoidable. It's kind of like Disney. You can't avoid him. He's had that much of a cultural impact on Western standards. So for better or worse, we got to accept him. And he is a genius. I am not in the camp that thinks that he didn't write his own plays, because even if he had people helping him, there's so much similarity between all the plays. I'm like, he had to have wrote the majority of it, if not all of it. So I'm not one of those Shakespeare didn't write his own stuff people. I believe that he did. And Shakespeare coined a lot of phrases and a lot of trends in plays that were just inspired by himself. So things like stage business. Stage business is when there are fast-moving props or set changes within a play. Because typically, see, what happened with Greek tragedies and Greek plays was that they started out with just being a chorus or a group of people on a street corner reciting lines or singing songs. That's what the earliest plays were like. And they slowly started to develop to where people would gather and watch a Greek tragedy or Greek play, but there weren't sets, there weren't a lot of props. They were usually people in robes with a giant, maybe papier-mâché mask, so you could tell from far away who the characters were, but that was it. There was not a lot of stage business. It was all just one scene, one location, and the entire play acted out with very few props. And Shakespeare, realizing the resources that they had at the time and what the audience at the time wanted, said, you know, we can keep doing these plays where it's just people in costumes with no props, but why not make it interesting? Why not have set changes? Why not go to different places in plays and show off locations to audiences and have props and characters and costume changes and things like that? And he kind of revolutionized that to be what we see today. And it's interesting to think that he kind of started that movement. Even though at the time of Shakespeare's plays, women were not allowed to be in plays, so every role was played by a man, including women. So there's that. Shakespeare also created specific genres of plays, such as intrigue and revenge tragedy. Intrigue is just what we know today as a modern-day mystery, suspense, or thriller, whereas revenge tragedy is obviously a tragedy about characters bent on revenge, and Hamlet is the most famous of that genre. And Macbeth would probably classify up there with it too, but Hamlet is the most famous, and it's in this book for a reason. Like I said, we will actually watch a video explaining the plot of Hamlet, so if you've never read it, or if you want a refresher, you can watch that video for that assignment. Shakespeare was a big mythology buff. He kind of reminds me of J.K. Rowling in that J.K. Rowling draws a lot of influence from Greek and Roman mythology in Harry Potter. Shakespeare drew a lot of influence from Greek tragedy. Like, he was obsessed with mythology and Greek plays, and you can kind of see that because a lot of his plays have a very tragic or similar themes and styles to that of Greek plays. He also coined these terms based on Greek plays as well. One is blank verse, which are unrhymed iambic pentameter style of playwriting, which is incredibly hard. And that's another thing too, is just the genius of his writing. To write in iambic pentameter the entire play is just, it would take a long time for me to do what he did with all those plays. And a colossal protagonist sounds very Greek too in terms of terminology. A colossal protagonist is just a main character that overshadows all other characters in the story. So for example, in Harry Potter, there's not really a colossal protagonist, because even though Harry's the central character, there's Hermione and Ron and Neville and Luna and other side characters that have similar weights to Harry, or also follow him on his quest and have distinct personalities. A colossal protagonist kind of overshadows everybody else and makes you only think of them. And Shakespeare relied on that because, you know, the printing press wasn't a big thing. There wasn't a lot of ways to distribute pamphlets or flyers about plays, so a lot of this was through word of mouth. And if you think about it, when people talk about a play, they usually just remember the title or the main character. So if you're reading Shakespeare and you're reading Hamlet, how many characters in Hamlet do you remember by name other than Hamlet? Now obviously I can name Rosencrantz and Guildenstern and Ophelia and Claudius, but that's because I've read it so many times. But if you were just somebody on the street, you know of Hamlet, you know who Hamlet is, but do you know the other characters? That is a colossal protagonist. Because Shakespeare wanted people, when they told their friends about the play, they'd be like, you've got to see Hamlet. Let me tell you about Hamlet. And that was how he got people to come to the theater, by spreading word of mouth using this colossal protagonist. And a lot of his plays are like that. Macbeth is like that. Romeo and Juliet are like that. I could probably ask a lot of people who the other characters besides Romeo and Juliet are in the play, and most of them will not be able to name me one other character. That's how strong those protagonists are, and that was Shakespeare's goal. And it's pretty ingenious in terms of marketing. I mean, he knew how to get people to come see his plays. But that's what that term means. And then Juxtapositions is on page 1371. It's after the play of Hamlet. And I wanted to point this out because I think it's interesting that if you look on page 1371 to 1377, I believe, or 78, there's all these different authors kind of giving their own interpretation of Hamlet. So someone analyzes Hamlet as a psychoanalytic piece, some look at the feminist part of Hamlet, but I thought it's interesting to see how they kind of broke down and explained how different movements apply to Hamlet. And it's something you might think about for your third paper if you see one of these plays and you want to analyze it through a certain lens. So if you want to look at, let's say, Antigone and look at women in Antigone and say, okay, how are they portrayed in Greek times different than what we see in even modern plays? That would be something interesting. So just pointing that out there, just throwing it out there for your reference. But that's Shakespeare. So we've got Greek tragedy, Shakespeare, and finally American drama. And American drama is its own genre that was started around the 1920s and carries into today. And the origins of it are pretty simple. Up until the 1920s, even in America, we were still watching a lot of Shakespearean plays, a lot of Greek tragedies. And audiences, in a similar vein to what we've looked at in fiction, audiences were starting to get fed up with stories about rich people and about royalty and wealth, because it wasn't a reflection of their own lives. So around the 1920s, when the Great Depression was going on, or when it had just started, people had very little money to begin with, and they would definitely not want to go and sit through a 3-hour play about rich people problems, and then have to leave that play and go back to their own lives, which were certainly not rich people problems. So a lot of playwrights at the time began writing plays that were about real problems going on in America at the time. So it was about real characters, ordinary families in serious settings with serious problems, and the plays were all about what these characters ended up doing and how they solved those problems. And so it was all about a connection to the audience. The audience could relate to who the play was about, and it became an extremely popular trend that we still see today. Chronological realism is a play that goes on in real time, and like I mentioned, Death of a Salesman and Raised in the Sun are two very extreme examples of using American drama realism. Death of a Salesman is all about a man who realizes that he cannot achieve the American dream, and it's depressing. And then A Raisin in the Sun is about a family who gets the chance at the American dream, and then mishaps ensue. So they're both plays that deal with real people, with real families, in very real situations, and it explores those situations through a very dramatic and theatrical lens. So it's a bit exaggerated, but it still kind of keeps itself in the realm of realism there. So that's American drama. And our book gives the example for American drama of Death of a Salesman and Raisin in the Sun, which, again, both of them are very, very interesting. Death of a Salesman is out there. It's a weird play. But the idea of this character, the protagonist, being kind of a failure is interesting because you kind of see him have a downward spiral. And the last chapter we're going to look at is chapter 30, which is comedy. And I love that on page... starts on 1555. There's a picture of Mark Twain. And I love that because Mark Twain is such a good comedic writer. But our last chapter focuses on comedy, and there's not too many slides about this, but I do want to go over them. And comedy has changed throughout the years in plays. When Greek plays used comedy, it was extremely crude and suggestive. And it was kind of what we would call risque. It was definitely edgy, because a lot of times plays in Greek times were not something that was for the sophisticated or rich to go to. It was kind of like that thing you did with your friends on Saturday. And so Greek comedies were very raunchy, they were very extreme, and they often had very crude humor. And Shakespeare sort of toned that back. A lot of Shakespeare's humor is very referential. It's very filled with references of the times, and it can be crude at some point, but it's a little more subdued than the comedy in Greek plays. And then American drama just kind of did whatever they wanted with comedy. But they also started three kind of subdivisions or subterms here, which I've got listed here. There's three forms of comedy that are popular in plays, besides just comedy in general. There are satires, parodies, and farce. And I've kind of broken them down here and included some examples. Satire is probably the most highbrow of the comedy, in that it's all about battling hypocrisy, callousness, stinginess. It's about commentating on a political or social thing in a very sophisticated and dry manner. So if you've ever heard of the Coen brothers, they write extremely dry humor that you're almost like, is this serious? Is it not? But their movies, Burn After Reading, or even Fargo, those are satires. They're making fun of something, but it's meant to be very serious when they're making fun of it. So satires are pretty popular. Not as popular as parody, I don't think. I think parody among these three terms is the most popular. And parody is just a distinctive and eccentric, visceral comedy. So I thought of three examples for this. One that I thought kind of borders along the line of farce and parody is that of Monty Python. If you've ever seen Monty Python and the Holy Grail, there are some parts of it that are a bit farcical, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But for the most part, it's a very eccentric comedy that it comments on politics, it comments on gender structures, on musicals, but it does so not in a serious way like a satire, but more in like a fun, eccentric, clever way. So that's what makes it a parody. Twin Peaks, if you've ever watched Twin Peaks, I love that show. It is a dark parody of soap operas, essentially. It's making fun of a lot of soap opera tropes and trends, but in a very dark and almost kind of scary way at times. And then there's Zach Galifianakis' parody show Between Two Ferns, which makes fun of the talk show format. So those are some examples too. And then finally we have farce. And farce is very surface level, lowbrow humor that critics usually frown upon, but audiences seem to like. And I have a guilty pleasure for the show Robot Chicken. Sometimes I have a guilty pleasure for that, because I know it's really stupid comedy and it's all just surface level, but sometimes it gets me. And the same goes for Family Guy. It's all surface level. South Park. Although South Park, the older the show gets, the more into parody and satire it gets, because there's sometimes when it gets a little heavy in its message and it's not just farce, but it kind of floats between those genres of comedy. So those are the three that you should look up, and there's examples in our book of them. They will be on your exam, so make sure you know the difference. And then the other terms we have are chase of wit, wordplay, puns, stock characters, and tragicomedy. Chase of wit we see in a lot of plays, and that's just characters trading quick remarks back and forth. So in the Avengers, when Iron Man talks to Loki, and Loki's like, I have an army, and Robert Downey Jr. is like, we have a Hulk. That's a chase of wit. It's that back and forth banter between characters. Wordplay is verbal humor, not the Jason Mraz song. And then puns are just iterations of words for humorous effect. So I think the joke is you can watch Batman and Robin and within 10 minutes find 100 puns with Arnold Schwarzenegger's Mr. Freeze, where he's like, cool party, or what killed the dinosaurs? The Ice Age, or something weird like that. That's a pun. And then stock characters are characters we expect to laugh at. So the fool, the nerdy guy, the class clown, like those are all kind of stock characters. It's very much like archetypes, where they are just generic, generalized characters. And then finally we have tragicomedy, which is a mixed genre. Often we refer to it as black or dark humor. I don't know if Trainspotting would be considered one of those, but there's quite a few tragicomedies out there. They're usually very dark, but they do have humorous moments to them. And that's it. That is our drama presentation. So one quick thing too, while you guys are working on your papers, I have noticed some students have asked about, with poetry, inserting, and I know it's probably going to be a little late when you watch this, but for future reference, or if you're revising your paper, some of you asked how you insert a picture into a Word document and move it around. So I've opened up a Word document here. What you do is you go up to Insert, and I'm going to put Insert, just use the browser here. And find just a random picture here. Let's do my cousin and I. Is that what we do? Okay, here we go. Alright, so once you have the picture there, typically Word does not like you to move it around because Word gets kind of finicky when you just try to move stuff without formatting it. So once you have the picture where you want it, you can go up here where it says Format Picture, and the first thing you should do is do text wrap or wrap text. And I always do it square because that gives you enough room where your text will type around it, and that will let you move your picture wherever you want. And then I can move it over here, I can make it smaller, I can make it bigger, I can pretty much do whatever I want with it. So that's how you put a picture into your paper. And for your poetry paper or your research paper, whatever, you can add pictures this way, or you can always attach them alongside the paper if you want to do that. But I kind of like putting it in the paper because I feel like it's more in the moment and organic, and it's easier to read. So yeah, that's that. Alright, so I hope this presentation was helpful for drama. I feel like our discussion forums and our reading response will really expand on this. There'll be some videos for you guys to watch, and I will apologize ahead of time. The videos for the reading response, I like them. I tried to find a good summary of Antigone and of Hamlet, and I actually did the ultimate English teacher taboo. I went to SparkNotes and found a video on Hamlet. I will tell you right now that the girl that reviews Antigone, she does her best to be engaging and fun to listen to. The guy describing Hamlet will probably put you to sleep, but I beg you to bear with me and bear through it. And if you've read Hamlet, then you should be fine. But if not, bear with me in the video. It is thorough, though, so I will say that. But anyway, that's all for right now. I will be posting a video about our final paper here in the next week or two. But otherwise, I hope you guys have a great time finishing up paper 2, working on your drama paper, and if you have questions, as always, just ask me. Alright, see you guys.